The European Union is sunk in misery, in the absolute worst shit, let's say it very clearly. And it's precisely now when the media mercenaries come into play to try to sell their population in the world. In general terms, a story that simply doesn't exist. They try to blame the absolutely terrible economic situation on the usual suspects. On whom? Maybe the answer will really surprise you, because we're here to do journalism and therefore to debunk Western propaganda. This is exactly what we're going to do, and we're going to do it with your help. On one hand, and with lots of new things. Stay very tuned to my social media, especially this YouTube channel, as well as Telegram, because despite the censorship, we're coming back stronger, and with everything, let's get started. Well, I imagine it's no surprise to anyone that in economic terms, among others, the European Union, not Europe, that's an important point, is basically at rock bottom. And I think it's almost starting to come to an end. What ends up being a nice trench to end up burying itself in economic terms, once again, among others. But this is where those I usually call media mercenaries appear, these useful journalists. There's another phrase that talks about being useful, but let's do this in a kind way and besides, smile along the way. Because it has really been the readers and followers themselves who have kept Western propaganda in check. In this case, it turns out that in order to somehow explain this string of unfortunate decisions, at the very least on the part of the European Union, supposedly according to the will of the United States, in overall terms, we have some journalists in this case from Spain, who are offering us an alternative argument that is the European Union. Things aren't going badly, but if they do, I'll handle it. It has nothing to do with the fact that Europe's leaders are doing a terrible job, selling themselves out to NATO's will. No, this has a very different point, an ideological point. Let's stay here because this really is one of the key points of what they're trying to do with the population in general. Well, it turns out that a recent economic study has come out that basically leaves the European Union at the mercy of others. As I said, a journalist from Spain, Christian Campos, comments on this. He writes, Europe, right? No company. In the top 25 most important companies internationally, you can see the attached table of the top companies where, surprise, the European Union is noticeably absent. And before, supposedly, it used to appear. Congratulations, says Christian Campos. Social democracy is moving full speed ahead toward the paradise of misery. Of course, success isn't to blame for what's happening. That the European Union, in its pursuit to satisfy the constant American desire to keep making more and more money at its expense, is impoverishing the population, precisely of the Union. That it has refused to buy cheaper resources from the Russian Federation, that it has refused to maintain any kind of relationship with the Russian Federation, that now it buys gas and oil from the United States at 4 or 5 times the price. That absolutely none of this has anything to do with it, because what's important here is to maintain this confrontation between the left and the right. The ideologies that, especially in the European Union, and particularly in Spain, seem to have been invented to keep the population dazed, so they look at the finger instead of raising their eyes to the moon. Be that as it may, the responses from internet users have been simply wonderful. First of all, of course, I responded. Mine is by no means the best, but I think it sums up quite well what is really happening. Very important announcement. Before we continue, now we are fighting censorship more actively than ever, and to help me, please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. And I also ask you to go to Liu Sivaya's channel, where many new things are waiting for you. Will you subscribe to it? And with that said, shall we continue? Christian, but what if it's the European Union, not Europe, that's in real trouble? Are you as much to blame as the social democracy you mentioned? Because they're supposed to be conservatives, and it's the right that's going to save Europe. You all have sold yourselves in Europe to the Yankees. You ran their campaign, and now you're reaping the consequences of not having even a minimum of sovereignty, right? But my answer, I repeat, is by no means the best, because this is where Carlos Cepeda comes in. I don't know who Carlos is, but to me, He will always be someone who knows how to respond in an absolutely brilliant way to a completely obvious manipulation. Carlos says to ask Grok before posting something like that. For example, more than half of European countries are governed by the right, only about 25% by the left, and the rest are centrist or mixed. In the European Union, 15 countries are governed by the right, 7 by the left, and 5 are centrist or mixed shot. And that's where, of course, Carlos also gets a response. In turn, governed by the elite, with a submissive social democracy, they tell him. Both the right and left are complicit in Europe's decline. This is where the story begins about a tougher right-wing democracy emerging in some European Union countries. In Spain, for example, where they say that the major parties are something like an amalgam of the usual social democracy, neither left nor right, says Carlos. Everything to the extreme center. That's right, but here the comments continue. Europe has been social democratic in the same way, of course, for 70 years now, no matter who governs, Christian democracy or social democracy. Here, Carlos grabs onto the right answer again and rides it like a wild horse. Well, what if he were right? Europe has been social democratic for 70 years, and before, it had companies among the top 25, but now it doesn't have them anymore. So it's not because it's social democratic, because that really hasn't changed. I mean, why? Here, I'll show you on one hand what the way of thinking is like in journalistic terms. But then, of course, there are people who follow Christian Campos very loyally, and that's what they're talking about. In the same way, has anything changed? Are they still responding to Carlos? Europe is no longer social democratic in the original sense of the concept. Today's Europe is a jumble of policies and intentions that we can sum up in one concept: populism. But it's populism, crappy populism. Very good. So I go back to the same point, says Carlos. Wouldn't it be the fault of social democracy? We'll have to analyze the causes and correct them. I believe in a strong Europe, and a lot of its directions really bother me. But it wouldn't occur to me to say that there are no companies in the top 25 because of the rise of the far right. I'll put it another way. Danny keeps insisting, who really does seem to be writing straight from La Laguna. Tell a social democratic worker from 100 years ago that he has to dig deeper into his pocket to support families who treat their women like cattle, and he'll smash your head in with a hammer. Now we're already criminalizing immigration. Well, we'll continue another day, says Carlos. No one is criminalizing immigration. That's their culture, and that's how it is. Social democracy is incompatible with that culture, which, by the way, seems to no longer exist in the European Union. And what about Danny in La Laguna? I don't know if he really thinks that's bad, good, or somewhere in between, because he's changed his vote so many times. Based on Carlos's answers so far, it's not even clear what his position is anymore. All of them are socialists. In any case, Christian Campos's followers are commenting in the same way again. And Carlos basically just laughs. Then they ask Christian another question that I think is very appropriate. In the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Taiwan, is the left in power? Wow, your post is so absurd. It seems like I brought this here just for us to have a laugh. Also, because with the current political situation, you have to try to have a good time, even if it's just a little. Not everything has to make us bitter, but honestly, this is a very serious sign of what's to come. And from now on, considering that the union is going to get worse and worse economically, and of course, no one will want to accept the first and most important responsibility at the international level, which is the fact that it has no sovereignty at all. Are they going to try to use this kind of argument between the left, the right, and populists and basically blame those in front of them? Few truly clear-headed voices remain in the European Union, and one of them is it still? Viktor Orbán points out that Europe doesn't have money, but still, despite all this, it still has a strong desire to wage war against the Russian Federation. Considering that we, Europeans, are going through a serious economic crisis, we need every cent. We have spent between 175 and 180 billion euros, and every year we will have to spend another 40, 50, or even 60 billion. We simply don't have that money. This strategy has no rational or financial basis. These statements are from Viktor Orbán. And he adds, "We are not in a position to finance this war and at the same time defeat an adversary of such caliber, and then continue to exist with the same money and the same economic power. All of this is an illusion. It will collapse and the consequences will be serious." Let me know what you think about what Viktor Orbán just said, on one hand, and about what's happening in the European Union on the other. What is clear is that from here, we must closely watch Western propaganda, because now it's going to get tougher than ever, since they have more and worse things to explain to their population each time. Where has the money gone, Santo? What have you spent so much on? So, where does that leave the well being of the Western population? We're going to clarify all of this anyway. I highly doubt they're going to answer any of these questions, but of course we will. So, subscribe to this channel because the most interesting part is just getting started.